This week on Jerusalem Dateline, 6 world powers in Iran decide to extend their nuclear talks. Will this allow Iran to become a nuclear power? We'll take a look. Plus, Scott Ross takes a look back at Jerusalem's history through the eyes of those who reunited the city. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline, coming to you this week from a rainy Jerusalem. The deadline for the nuclear deal between the 6 world powers, called the P5+1 and Iran, came and went this week. The parties decided to keep talking and set July 2015 as their next deadline. Regardless of the time frame, Israel believes that Iran's nuclear program poses a threat not only to Israel, but to the world as well. Here's our story from earlier this week, followed by a roundtable discussion with CBN's John Wagi and Julie Stahl. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu believes the West needs to keep up the economic pressure on Iran.
I think the key principle is this: don't dismantle sanctions before you dismantle Iran's capacity to make a nuclear bomb. And as I understand it, the Iranians are nowhere near to accepting that. And if, for any reason, the United States and the other powers agree to leave Iran with that capacity to break out, I think that would be a historic mistake.
Netanyahu says a bad deal would allow Iran to keep its thousands of centrifuges. With those centrifuges, Iran could enrich enough uranium in a very short time to build a nuclear bomb. Yuval Steinitz, Israel's Minister of Intelligence and Strategic Affairs, told reporters Iran is not being flexible.
But on the core issue of the uranium enrichment capability, they made almost no concessions.
The current deal restricts Iran's program for 10 years, but doesn't dismantle its nuclear infrastructure. After 10 years, Iran might be free to join the nuclear club. Israel sees this sunset clause as the Achilles heel of the agreement. It could back Israel into a corner where the military option is their only way out. Steinitz says the current deal has dangerous loopholes.
If these loopholes are not totally closed, it enables the Iranian to bypass the agreement and to make the agreement meaningless.
He emphasized what's at stake.
This is going to create a new dangerous world for decades. This is really about the future of the world, not just about the future of Israel or the Middle East or about the security of Europe and the United States.
Netanyahu says the proof is that Iran is developing ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Why in heaven's name does Iran need intercontinental ballistic missiles? They don't need those missiles to reach Israel. They need it to reach Europe and the United States. And the only thing you carry on intercontinental ballistic missiles are nuclear warheads.
For Israel, he said, all options are on the table.
Israel itself will always reserve the right to defend itself against any threat with its own power.
Well, joining me to talk more about the Iran nuclear talks and other news of the week is CBN News senior editor John Wagi in our Virginia Beach studio, and in our Jerusalem bureau here, Julie Stahl. John, first to you. Can you tell me, the Iran nuclear talks were postponed for another 7 months. What's your reaction to those decisions?
Well, I think that the talks are first and foremost with the Obama administration here in the States, and those talks weren't going to collapse if John Kerry had anything to say about it and Barack Obama's foreign policy team had anything to say. And so they will continue. There are reports that the Iranians were pretty nasty to Kerry, shouting at him and all those kind of things in Vienna, but it didn't seem to make any difference. The talks will go forward. They bought time. That's exactly what the Iranians wanted. And so there will be negotiations about negotiations for months more on end.
Yeah, until next July. Julie, what's the reaction here in Israel?
Well, Israel's actually relieved that they didn't come to a deal. Like as Prime Minister Netanyahu has been saying all along, no deal is better than a bad deal. So at least for now, they have no deal. But you can be sure that Israel's going to keep up the pressure to not to have a bad deal. That this is not the end of the road, end of the story. I wouldn't say Israel is relieved, although they definitely welcomed the decision.
Right, right. John, now that the Republicans are going to control the Senate in January, do you think this is going to change the calculus for the Obama administration and for the new Senate?
I don't see how it could help but change things, Chris. The Obama administration has used Harry Reid as a cover for a lot of the foreign policy things they wanted to accomplish, leaving the Senate out of it, even though there's bipartisan consensus among Republicans and Democrats, among the top leadership in foreign policy, that Congress must have a role in any kind of agreement with Iran. And they're very concerned that the administration and its team might allow Iran to get away with some slipshod nuclear kind of tactics and that kind of thing that would produce that bad agreement that Israel is so concerned about. And the U.S. Congress does not want that either. And so I think there's bound to be more scrutiny come January, and maybe some bipartisan efforts to get Congress to ratchet down these sanctions and make sure that there are tough sanctions that are going to be imposed on Iran, and that Iran doesn't get wiggle room from letting the talks go on in Vienna while they spin their centrifuges faster and faster.
Exactly. Some of the other big news, John, in Washington was the quote-unquote resignation of Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. Many people believe that he was fired. What impact do you think that's going to have on Mideast policy by the Obama administration here in the region?
Well, I think in the short term, the Obama administration gets a more cohesive unit. There was all kinds of reporting about backbiting and infighting among national security advisors and Hagel at Defense. I think that those things are going to continue even under a new Secretary of Defense. But I think that the administration, at least within the confines of the White House, will be able to speak with one voice again. But that doesn't solve any of the problems with ISIS, with Iran, with the foment in Syria, all those kinds of things. Those problems are still going to be there and on the table, and I think that the United States adversaries are going to be perfectly happy to try and test the limits of Washington's foreign policy acumen right now.
Right. Julie, here in Israel, some of the news that people in the United States might not know is a new law that's being proposed, and it actually might threaten the Netanyahu's coalition government. What is this new law, and what are the implications?
The law that's being called the Jewish law is basically enshrining in law Israel as a Jewish state. It doesn't really change anything for the citizens of Israel. Netanyahu said this is the most vibrant democracy. Obviously, it's the only democracy in the Middle East. It's not going to threaten the rights for Arab citizens, for Israeli Arabs, for other minorities in Israel, but it's going to enshrine certain things like Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, the hope, the Jewish hope, in law, that would be the national anthem, and the right for Jews around the world to immigrate to Israel freely. So he really wants to make that clear that this is a Jewish state. It is causing a lot of division here in Israel from the left. People are saying, why are you doing this now at a time when we really need to stand together? It's creating a lot of division. I don't know where it's going to lead. Netanyahu seems to think this is really the time he needs to propose this law.
And apparently there might be a vote next week. And John, what do you think, given the current structure of the government and the electoral map, as it were, what do you think is going to happen if they do go to new elections?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister Netanyahu may feel for national security reasons that he needs to have a more cohesive government. Instead of this constant backbiting over various issues, he may want to go to early elections because polls show his party doing very well and gaining seats, and also some of the religious parties, neo-religious parties, who would take a strong Zionist stance, they also would gain seats. And that would be trouble for the Obama administration, but it might help Netanyahu shore up his government and not have this internal bickering at a time of extreme national security importance for Israel, whether it's the Palestinian attacks in Jerusalem, whether it's Iran's nuclear weapons, whether it's ISIS in Syria and Iraq. All these problems, Netanyahu needs to not be brushing flies away all the time, and that seems to be a lot of what he has to do. So I can understand he would be tempted to do it. I know Israelis are not ready for elections. They wouldn't really like to see it happen, but it may happen, and Netanyahu may be doing it for some non-political security reasons.
That's right. Well, we'll see what happens next week if and when this comes to a vote. And so, John, thanks for joining us in Virginia Beach, and Julie, thanks for joining us here in the Jerusalem Bureau. Coming up, Scott Ross talks with author Yossi Klein Halevi about the days when Israel captured the Old City for the first time in 2,000 years. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. For several weeks, Jerusalem, and especially the Temple Mount, have been the focus of conflict and controversy. Scott Ross talked with Yossi Klein Halevi about the book he wrote, Like Dreamers, about the men who reunited the city of Jerusalem during the 1967 Six-Day War.
Where did you get the title Like Dreamers? Now there are Bible verses from scriptural verses from Joel about the young men having visions, the old men dreaming dreams. There's also Psalm 126. I can quote this from. When God brings about the return to Zion, we were like dreamers. Then our mouths will be filled with laughter, our tongues with joyous song. And that's where you got the title.
That's where I got it. In fact, the epigraph of the book is Psalm 126.
This book of yours, it is history of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem after the Six-Day War, 1967. Yet your premise and the way you've approached this is to personalize the story through the lives and the eyes of 6 paratroopers.
See, I felt that what was missing in the way people relate to the story of Israel was that personal connection.
Right.
They're literally minutes out of battle.
Look how young they are.
22, 23 years old. And so these are the poster boys of my generation. I grew up with that image as symbolizing the Like Dreamers story of Israel. And I always wondered, well, what happened to them? I know how they affected me. I moved to Israel because of these men.
One quote, Hanan Porat,
yes,
one of the paratroopers said, "We're writing the next chapter of the Bible."
Yes.
That's how they saw it.
That's exactly right. And he said that to a friend of his as they were heading toward the wall on the morning of June 7th, 1967. This book is really a story of an Israeli band of brothers. Young Israeli men who gave the Jewish people their greatest victory, I would say, in history. And that was really a kind of almost the spiritual equivalent of the Big Bang in Jewish history.
The Big Bang?
The Big Bang.
Oh, the Big Bang, yeah.
The spiritual equivalent of, suddenly we're born again as a people.
Yeah.
And the 7th day of the Six-Day War, we are a new people. And each of these men who joined together to deliver this inconceivable victory against overwhelming odds.
What were the odds?
You had 3 Arab countries converging on Israel. Israel's borders at that time were 8 miles wide at their narrowest point. And the Arab leaders, Nasser in Egypt and Hussein in Jordan, were promising that they were going to drive the Jews into the sea.
They're still promising.
Some of them are, yes.
Right.
That goes back to your question about what's changed here and what hasn't changed.
Right.
We're still facing existential threat.
Right.
But in 1967, May 1967, Israeli Jews were digging mass graves in the parks in this country because there was the sense that we are going to have to bury, God forbid, tens of thousands of people. Israelis, I think, felt that we would win the war, but just barely. And I remember as a Jew in the United States watching the news and seeing these crowds of thousands of demonstrators in Cairo and Damascus chanting death to Israel, death to the Jews, holding banners imprinted literally with skulls and crossbones. You just can't imagine that. But that I remember vividly and thinking, my God, it's going to happen again, a second Holocaust. And then not only does Israel manage to avert destruction, but it turns destruction into the greatest victory in the history of the Jewish people.
Coming up, a talk with an Israeli lawyer who hits terror groups where it hurts, in their pocketbooks. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. How do you fight terror groups? Obviously with increased security, But we talked earlier with an Israeli lawyer, Nitsana DarshanLeitner, who hits terrorists where it hurts, in their bank accounts.
We came up with this idea to bring lawsuits against terrorism. We started bringing lawsuits against the organizations, state-sponsored terrorism, banks that provide financial services to organizations. And slowly, we got decisions in our favors. We have, today we represent hundreds of terror victims in cases against Iran, Syria, North Korea, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, PLO, and against banks like UBS, American Express Bank, Lebanese Canadian Bank, Central Bank of Iran, Bank of China. And we're holding judgments for more than $1 billion. And we collected, actually got more than $120 million that went to the hands of the terror victims. And in the framework of this work, we are fighting terrorism. We are stopping the money from going to the hands of the terror organizations. We seize the money, we get restraining orders against them. You know, in the end of the day, the terror organizations living in a real world. They need money, they need assets, they need ways to wire their money, and if you block it, you actually block the terrorism.
How does it actually work? I mean, how do you actually stop those terror, the funding of terror organizations?
Well, if you file a lawsuit against a bank, the bank immediately will freeze the account, whether you win the case or not. Like, I can give you an example of Arab banks and European banks and even Chinese banks that used to wire money in the midst of the Intifada to Hamas, Islamic Jihad terror organizations in Gaza. And what we did is filing lawsuits against these banks for aiding and abetting terrorism. You are not allowed to provide financial services or any type of services to a terror organization. You're violating American law and even international law. And as a result of these cases, banks all over the world change the way they're doing businesses, because no bank anymore agrees to open bank accounts to a designated terror organization because they will be sued. Not even that, most of the banks in the Western world check any Islamic charity if it has any contacts with a terror organization. And lastly, banks are very scared to provide financial services in terror zones. So there is no banking system in South Lebanon. There is no banking system in Gaza. This is why you see them smuggling money into Gaza with suitcases in cash through the tunnels. And that causes them a great deal of harm, because they need to bring hundreds of millions of dollars to operate. You block that, you block their operations. And if banks don't wire money anymore, and if all they can get through the tunnels is very little money, they have a huge problem. And indeed, we were told by the security forces in Israel that as a result of our cases, money diverted to terrorism reduced in 60% in Gaza alone. Hamas in Gaza is like a government. It is a government. They need a ton of money in order to operate, in order to gain the loyalty of the citizens, in order to for the citizens to allow Hamas to shoot missiles towards Israel from their backyard. They need to be loyal, and you buy loyalty with money.
Did all these things change after the second Intifada and after 9/11? Did the banks all of a sudden take notice of what they should or shouldn't do?
The banks realize that they are wiring money only as a result of these lawsuits against them. After 9/11, there was a shockwave in the international banking system, but they weren't aware to the impact that they have on terrorism, on wiring money to terrorism. Only due to the cases against them, you know, only when you get hit in your pocket, then you realize that you might do something wrong. So after 9/11, there were all these rules by the American government: know your customer, right? Try to open a bank account in the United States today, you won't be able to do it so easily. But the most effective, the biggest effect that was on banks is this litigation against them.
Up next, finding a 2,000-year-old treasure in Jerusalem. Finally this week, archaeologists keep uncovering Jerusalem's ancient history. Julie Stahl brings us one of our favorite stories where archaeologists discovered a rare gold bell that could have been part of a priestly garment during the time of Jesus.
That's the sound of a 2,000-year-old tiny gold bell.
And the man that was walking with that bell on his coat, everyone was here when he coming, it's a small noise, it's not a big noise, just to give some respect to this man.
Archaeologists uncovered the bell while excavating an ancient drainage channel. It begins at the Pool of Siloam and continues underground to an area near the western wall called Robinson's Arch. That's where Jewish worshippers would have entered the Temple Mount in the time of Jesus.
And this bell we found under the main street of Jerusalem from the Second Temple period.
The bell has a tiny loop at the top. It would have been attached to the garment of a wealthy person. The Bible describes the robe of Aaron the high priest, saying, "Upon its hem you shall make pomegranates of blue, purple, and scarlet all around its hem, and bells of gold between them all around." Head archaeologist Eli Shukrun says there's no way to know for sure if the bell came from a priestly garment.
It could be anyone, but I think with the high position in Jerusalem from the Second Temple period.
He believes the bell fell off the man's garment and into the drainage channel.
After 2,000 years, we were walking very hard in the tunnels of Jerusalem. And after 2,000 years, we found that bell in the tunnel.
Shukran says discoveries like the little golden bell shed light on the nature of Jerusalem in Second Temple times. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Uncovering artifacts like the bell is part of the wonder of Jerusalem. Well, that's it for this edition. Check us out also on Facebook, Twitter, and you can watch our podcast on iTunes. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.